I want to thank Barry for doing this meeting for us. He's been a good friend of ours for a long time. He's been my go-to digital guru for a long time. I feel like whatever Barry whatever Barry tells me, I trust it. If you guys aren't familiar with Soundkeeper, check it out. His new recording from the Cosmic American Derelicts is awesome. It's a kind of an alt country album. If you like Sun Volt and Jay Farrar and that kind of music, it's right up your alley. And I have to say that one of the tracks, I just was in tears the first time I heard it. It was that good. So Barry, I'll let you take it away and let's see if we can get the screen share going.
Thank you for the vote of confidence and for your kindness. Let me start up the share. It's good to see some familiar faces again and some new friends, I hope. Thank you all for having me. I hope this is of interest to you. It's basically about Soundkeeper Recordings. I'll talk about, well, I'm going to start with a postulate that I've discovered. I've been an audiophile for a lot of years, like all of you. And I have this postulate that I think says a lot about my experience over, I don't know how many decades now. From there, I'll just go quickly through how I got to where I am, and then I'll share a few things about each of the Soundkeeper recordings. There aren't many yet. It's not the kind of thing where I churn out a monthly release. It's more like whenever I find a band that's interesting to me and the idea is interesting to them, we go ahead and make a recording. So I hope that's of interest. First, the postulate. What I found is if you ask 3 audio folks a question, you'll get at least 4 different answers, 5 of which may well be wrong. We all have our own perspectives. I don't know. I think a lot of things in audio don't have a right or wrong, in spite of what some people on Internet Audio Fora would suggest. I think it's a matter of what appeals to your ears. So I will speak on my own experience. Not everyone will agree, some may, and that will be that. So I can start by saying that I've been fascinated by music as long as I can remember. And being in the presence of the music as it's created, I think is pretty close to a magical experience. But of course, we can't always have music all the time, live music all the time. And for that, we have recordings and audio. And it's been my good fortune to have worked on recordings by some of my favorite artists and to have met and spent time with a number of my audio heroes on both sides of the studio glass. Creators of the music, creators of the hardware and software that allow us to enjoy the music. Where I started was with something like this. It may seem familiar to many of you. It was my introduction to Gilbert and Sullivan, to Rodgers and Hammerstein, to Goffin and King, and ultimately to Lennon and McCartney. It all came from a device very much like this. I believe it was an RCA, although it didn't look exactly like this one. Around the time I was 10 or 11, I used to gather with friends weekly, one friend in particular, and we would have what we would call our jam sessions, where I would play guitar or drums. My friend wrote music, and we, on this device, which was my brother had a Concord tape recorder, a 440, I believe was the model number. And I note, if you notice, the record buttons on the right side are separate for each channel. So I discovered that I could make a recording on one channel, and then while it was playing back, only engage record on the other channel and add other musical parts. In a sense, I found overdubbing before I knew what it was. And then I started reading the magazines. I was reading everything I could get my hands on, as I'm sure many of you have. I was reading Stereo Review, High Fidelity. My favorite was Audio at that time, of those 3, particularly Burt White's Behind the Scenes column and Richard Heiser's writings. In the early 70s, I discovered that there were magazines in other parts of the world, and I came to magazines from the United Kingdom, where I first read John Atkinson's work. And shortly after that, I found two other magazines, one J. Gordon Hult's Stereophile and Harry Pearson's Absolute Sound, with altogether different perspectives. They actually evaluated music by listening to it, which seemed revolutionary at the time compared to what was happening in the three major magazines, where I'd get a lot of numeric evaluations, basically the specifications. I wonder how many are familiar with this. This was a coffee table book by Mark Toback in the, I guess in the mid 70s, late 70s. It was the subject of a lot of conversations with some close friends of mine. We would gather a few times a week and have an evening's discussion about preamps or loudspeakers. One of those friends brought over some unusual loudspeaker cables one day. I wondered, how could loudspeaker cables possibly make a difference? And he connected them to my system, and I learned something. This same person on another occasion brought over his AR turntable when I had a very fashionable direct drive unit at the time. And I thought, how can a turntable make a difference? They just turn. But we connected his turntable and I learned again. And a lot of our evenings were spent over this book, which first talked about Marantz, Dynaco, Dahlquist, Magnapan, audio research, Mark Levinson, the early high-end audio. In 1975, I answered an ad in the New York Times and got my first job in a recording studio. 20 years old, fresh out of college. And the traditional means of entering the ranks then was as a gopher, what they called a gopher, sometimes called a button pusher. Basically, I would set up the tape recorders, move the mic stands around, set things up per the instructions of the main engineer. And in those days, gophers did not get paid at all. Assistants in the studio did not get paid. I was actually hired with a regular salary of $77 a week. That's how I started. Very early on in the studio, as the environment and the procedures became familiar, I started to notice something. What I heard in the control room didn't sound like what I heard out in the studio with the musicians. We had these large speakers called Big Reds based on Altec 604 drivers, up on the front, hung on the front wall at the junction of the front wall and ceiling, which is where typically the large speakers in studios are. Not the best place to have loudspeakers, but listening to these, the amazing thing about them was how dynamic they were. They were incredibly dynamic, much more so than just about any audiophile speaker I've ever heard. But they didn't sound, other than that dynamic slam, they didn't sound like what I heard in the studio. The other thing that was in use were these little 4-inch full range drivers. I believe they could have been Bose drivers. And they were used on the meter bridge of the console as a check against what the larger speakers presented. They each presented their own version of the sonic story. The adjustments that were made while listening to the big speakers didn't always work on the small speakers. Similarly, adjustments to the sound on the small speakers didn't always make sense when they were played back on the large speakers. When I took the finished record home, it didn't make any sense either. So at the time, I asked the senior engineer about the discrepancy between the sound in the control room and the sound out in the studio. And what he said was, it's not supposed to sound like what I heard out in the studio. I never understood exactly what it was supposed to sound like. Actually, I began to wonder about a lot of things at the time. Every mic we had in the mic closet had a distinctive sound. Each added its own character to what was captured. One of those large diaphragm condensers lent a certain crispness to the sound of a grand piano or a drummer's cymbals, but it was not the sound of the piano or the cymbals that I heard out in the studio. Switching to dynamic microphones warmed up the sound and perhaps lost a bit of the crispness, but this too wasn't exactly what I heard out in the studio. Coming from an audiophile background, this was something that was on my mind all the time. Back at home, as I said, I heard another sound and I wondered which of these, if any, was the truth. But in the end, I came to feel that at the time, none of them was. So in the space of a little more than 2 years, I entered the record business as an assistant. I was promoted to senior and then chief engineer. And the good thing about that was I got to experiment to my heart's desire. I was overdubbing, recording, mixing, and the first studio I worked at, which was an R&B based studio in Englewood, New Jersey, later famous for its hip hop productions, but they had a mastering room with a Scully lathe. So I learned to cut vinyl there as well. And every day there presented new opportunities to experiment, to try ideas, to listen and learn. Granted, not all art is representational or literal. Sometimes the goal is to create something that doesn't occur in reality. You can't record Sgt. Pepper or certain Pink Floyd recordings in a purist fashion and get what they achieve in the studio. Many artists like to get new sounds, unlike what actually emanates from their instruments. I know the Beatles were always looking for something new. They sought to create sonic landscapes and sounds that we'd not heard any other way. Wonderful and magical as many of them are, and I believe they are, they were made to sound like records. I was also interested in records that sounded like performances, having come from the audiophile side of things. So I think we have two approaches, and each with its own rewards. One of the things I found that would happen in the studio a lot, I came to think of as the three most heard phrases in record making. Often during cutting of the tracks, sometimes one of the musicians would say they weren't pleased with what they were hearing in the control room. And what they heard in the control room was, don't worry about it, we'll fix it in the mix. So they come back to the mixing session, hoping to fix whatever it was that was bothering them. And they were told, don't worry about it, we'll catch it in the mastering. So sometimes they'd attend the mastering session and other times they wouldn't. But if they did attend the mastering session, what I found quite often was what they heard was, they'll never hear it at home. And rumor has it that Frank Zappa, having experienced these things, came up with, we'll fix it in the shrink wrap. Years passed at the studio, 2 years at that studio, and I heard there was an opening at a big studio in New York, an opening for an editor, and I had experience editing. I called up Atlantic Studios and got a position there as an editor. I spoke with the studio manager. I was accepted for the position, and so many of the records I'd grown up, others that were significant parts of the soundtrack of my life, were made in that room at Atlantic. It was such a great place to walk into. I mean, names sped through my mind like Ray Charles, the Coasters, the Drifters, the Rascals, Aretha Franklin, Dr. John, John Coltrane, Ornette Coleman, Charles Mingus, Crosby, Stills and Nash. The list goes on and on. The roster also included a long list of artists who recorded elsewhere, but whose work was released on Atlantic, like Led Zeppelin, Yes, King Crimson, Genesis, AC/DC, Robert Plant, Phil Collins, the Rolling Stones, a dizzying array of musical delights for a new employee in his early 20s. To friends, I summed up my primary responsibilities as a music editor as being to make long songs shorter and short songs longer. We would take an album version of a song and cut it down to 3 minutes for a radio play, 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes. But at the time in the late 70s, the dance clubs were really big and they wanted longer versions of songs. So how do you take a 4-minute, 5-minute song and turn it into an 8 or 9 minute song? You double solos, add extra choruses, repeat certain verses. So this was all done. That was my job, basically, to make long songs shorter and short songs longer. Then this happened in 1983, early 83. I created my first compact disc master at Atlantic. Atlantic's West Coast affiliate, which was Warner Brothers, was already creating CD masters when it was decided that Atlantic would open its own CD mastering room. So some of the earliest CD releases on the Atlantic and Electro labels were done on the West Coast. But after that, I was essentially the CD mastering department. It was unusual because I was used to using one of these to edit tape, one of these combined with this, an Editol bar. Some of you may recognize this. It basically had an angled cut and a straight cut in the bar to guide your razor blade. You would lay your tape in that track, and then you could join the tape together and put the guides help you align a piece of tape to join the tape back together into a single piece. So that was how I used to edit. Then this came out. Editing for CDs involved using a unit like this, which at the time looked to me like the controls on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise. Editing for a CD in those days actually involved making a new recording. You'd have two machines on the left that would be your playback machines. You could feed from either one of them and combine them to a machine on the right side of this board that would be your record machine. So you never lost your original digital recordings. They were always created anew. Of course, several years later, it moved over to the computer, and this is what it looks like now. So the visualization of the waveforms makes it really easy. You could zoom in as far as you like. And when I first started editing this way, I thought I can get in and out in the width of a razor blade. It seemed super fine. So having long experienced what I thought to be inadequate monitoring in the studios I worked in and visited and read about in the professional-oriented magazines, I sought to do something different in the new CD mastering room at Atlantic. Rather than loudness optimized speakers placed against the wall near the corners, over the engineer's head, or small dynamically challenged speakers placed where they would create a mid-range dip at the listening position, I wanted to bring some audiophile sensibilities into the room. So at my request, the studio management agreed to install a pair of Dahlquist DQ10s, my favorite speakers at the time. These were placed a few feet off the wall. This is not the mastering room. This is just a picture of the speakers I found on the web. But they were placed well off the wall and elevated a bit more than this. So there was nothing near the speakers. Once the room was properly set and known master tapes played back to my satisfaction, it was time to get my first really good listen to digital audio. The advance word from the hobbyist and pro magazines, who'd already gotten to listen to a bunch of earlier CD samples, was very positive. Everyone was very enthusiastic. They talked about the widely touted perfect sound forever. With great enthusiasm and anticipation, I listened to my first sample. Then I listened to another. I listened to all the samples we had, and I went back and listened to some analog master tapes and vinyl LPs to be sure the monitoring was what I expected it to be. With the analog sources, it was. With the digital sources, I wondered just what everyone was talking about. A fellow mastering engineer, one whose work I had admired for years, called one day and invited me to sit on a panel of mastering engineers to discuss CD at an AES meeting, at a meeting of the Audio Engineering Society in New York. I gratefully accepted, and not long afterward found myself sitting at a long table on stage in an auditorium next to 4 other colleagues, all of us involved in CD mastering. When I spoke, I felt quite alone in that my colleagues all sang the praises of the new medium. I was pretty shy at the time, a 20-something kid, and I just said, I don't feel it sounds as good as my vinyl yet. I explained how the vinyl was revealing more of the information I heard on the master tapes. And despite any technical flaws or issues in manufacturing, the things that plagued CD, I wasn't hearing them on vinyl in the same way. They each had their own issues, but the vinyl was providing more music to my ears. When I left that evening, I thought folks were looking at me as though I had 2 heads. I think I was the only voice in the room that said, well, CD has a little way to go. Happily, I think it has in the years since, but it's been a lot of years. I think at the time I was saying that we've had vinyl for 100 years. So at the time I expected within 100 years, CD would sound as good. Happily, it took less time for CD to get much better. As it grew, we started using more and more replication facilities. This is what I talked about before, when sales of a particular release were expected to be large, often a single replicator couldn't produce a sufficient quantity of the discs. So I'd create a CD master and then send clones of that master to different replicators. When the discs came back, I made another discovery, which I mentioned earlier. The discs from all the replicators sounded different from each other, sometimes subtly and other times not so subtly. None of the discs sounded indistinguishable from the master used to make it. I found the idea of a simpler approach intriguing, and I began to experiment with a first principles strategy, questioning every aspect of record making, every single component of the process, every single decision involved. I came up with what I came to call the questions. They're questions that I was never taught to ask. I don't think students in audio engineering schools ever encountered them either. And the questions are simple, in fact, so simple, I think they might tend to get overlooked. Like, why use this microphone? When I was an assistant in the studio, the engineer would say, set up an 87 next to that and put a 441 on the snare drum. And I was wondering, why this microphone? What results do I expect from selecting this microphone? I think these are things that engineering students should be taught to ask. What results might occur that I don't expect? Why place it here? Why am I turning this particular knob to adjust the sound? What did I do wrong in a previous step that I believe will be remedied by turning this knob? What results might occur that I don't expect? These are the kind of questions I started to ask myself. I realized that between the pro and audiophile worlds, I was straddling two different worlds. I mentioned a long time ago in a blog entry I wrote, a growing awareness, my earliest days as an engineer, what I previously thought of as the audio world was in fact two worlds. And I came to feel that each of the worlds could learn something from each other to the mutual benefit of all concerned, especially the listener. I was reminded of how little interaction there tends to be between pro audio and audiophile worlds. To this day, it seems to me that too many pros miss opportunities for much higher quality audio. Again, this is just my opinion. And all too often, audiophiles lack an understanding of how their records are made. I think one of the best examples of this I used to see on the internet was the often mentioned desirability by audiophiles of flat transfers. The idea being that the finished masters should be used as sources for the replicated copies that we all get at home, with no equalization or any other processing. In my early days as an engineer, I felt the same way. Then I had the opportunity to hear how master tapes actually sound. When you consider the types and number of microphones, where they're placed, the signal path in most studios, and the monitoring, it shouldn't be a surprise that most masters need help. Not all, but in my experience as a mastering engineer, most. Put another way, if a recording was made with sufficient treble energy that it can bring a headache to the listener, and I can make it hurt less by using a judicious application of EQ, I would think EQ is a good thing. In fact, a tiny minority of well-made recordings are best served with no EQ at all, but most studio recordings I find do benefit. One interesting thing to me is that I started as an engineer in 1975, but I don't think I really grokked EQ until 1990. It took that long to learn how to apply equalization without it sounding like equalization, how to bring out a little more presence in a guitar without making it sound like I've added 5 kilohertz. But one of the most important things to me in doing this is when I used different studios as an independent mastering engineer, I wondered how trustworthy is the monitoring. It was always the monitoring that attracted me to a studio or repelled me. Whatever the reason, I find that's the most important tool, because if you can't hear what you're doing, the rest of the tools a studio offers don't really have much value. Some of you may recognize this person. I've always enjoyed it when an audiophile sensibility entered into the pro audio world and pointed to what could be. Some of my fondest memories of my years at Atlantic involve time spent with the great mastering engineer, George Purist. When I knew George, he was a bit older than this photo, which may have been taken when he was at Fine Recording. George would often tell me of his early days working with Bob Fine and Wilma Cozart on their recordings for Mercury Living Presence. This was all new to me. I'd not heard of these before, and when I followed up to find some of them, I found a great many joys, both musical and sonic. Bob Fine was to become one of my engineering heroes and one of my inspirations, so much as he made his stereo recordings with only 3 microphones. George was to become one of my mastering heroes for his preservation of musical dynamics. He remains one of a tiny handful of mastering engineers I can name who don't routinely apply dynamic compression to everything that passes his signal path. Everything George mastered, from Bob Fine's classics to much of Atlantic's classic jazz and rock recordings, has a sense of life to it. One of my favorite memories was made one day when I walked past the outside of his mastering room. You have to picture, there were double doors, heavily padded double doors with a vestibule to enter the mastering rooms, to make them, to soundproof them. The rooms themselves were rooms within rooms, floating floors, not attached to the walls or ceiling or floor. So in an effort to minimize sound transmission outside of the room. I walked past the room and I heard really loud music coming through the double padded doors. And I often visited George in his room, so I decided to visit. And as I entered the room, I saw George leaning over the microscope of his lathe, examining the fresh groove he was cutting, while AC/DC's music virtually peeled the paint from the mastering room walls. For me, it remains one of the greatest moments of rock. And many of you may recognize his scribe in the lead out grooves of the vinyl you have. I miss George. He didn't mince words also. He wasn't really an audiophile. He just was one of those folks who could accurately intuit what a recording needed and apply it. He didn't mince words with regard to program material or some of the tools popular in audio engineering circles in those days. In fact, he was famous for what we came to call Pyrrhusisms. His commentary that would sometimes include language that would make a Marine drill sergeant blanch. But he was more famous for the same honesty he brought to his recorded work. And actually, through George, I met some audiophile names that visited his mastering room. Through George, I was introduced to Bert White, whose behind the scenes column was a favorite of mine in audio. Bert was the engineer on a lot of the great Everest recordings. And like Bob Fine, he also used only 3 microphones and created fabulous results. I got to take home a test cut of Stravinsky's L'Histoire du Soldat, a personal favorite. And I never heard it sound so good before. On another occasion, Joe Grado came up to work with George. Joe was the inventor of the cartridge I was using at home on my turntable. And I also learned when he was there that he was an operatic tenor, a master chef, kind of a Renaissance man. And I remember being in the mastering room with both George and Joseph. And Joe said, we were talking about the mastering monitors. And Joe said, "You see, Barry, George uses these studio monitors with no complaints." And George looked up from the lathe and said, "You mean those pieces of sh?" So it came time to leave Atlantic and go independent. I decided I really wanted to go independent as a mastering engineer. And I formed Barry Diamond Audio in 1987. And in keeping up with contacts in both the pro and audiophile world, an opportunity arose to visit the editor of one of the audiophile publications I was reading. I knew his reference system was reputed to be among the best. I was not at all prepared for what I was going to hear, though. I was going to hear stereo for the first time. I mentioned being an engineer since 1975 and finally understanding how to EQ in 1990. I finally understood what stereo meant in 1988. My conception before that was based on what I'd always been taught. Some sounds from the left speaker, some sounds from the right speaker. There were recordings of marching bands proceeding across the room from one to the other. Most of the time I'd seen stereo speakers. They were placed as far apart as they could possibly be in a room, often in the corners. I thought I'd made great progress myself when I found that moving the speakers out from the corners and away from the wall improved the sound. What I didn't realize was I was still listening to a pair of what might be effectively called dual mono sources. There was sound from the left, still sound from the right. It was nice and it was fun, but it wasn't stereo. Among the first things I noticed when I visited that evening, aside from the jaw-dropping gear that I'd only seen in magazine photos, was the speakers seemed to me in the middle of the room. They just weren't just out from the corners or off the wall. They were well out into the space. There was lots of room all around them, and I'd never seen a setup done this way. One of the first records we played was an old, well-worn Leonard Cohen album, and the track just featured his voice and acoustic guitar. It wasn't a super record, but what I heard was entirely unexpected. There was no sound from the left speaker and no sound from the right speaker. Instead, that whole part of the room came alive with a hologram, an audio hologram. And it was as if we were in that studio as Leonard Cohen sang his song. The loudspeakers were outstanding at disappearing, but they should be for their six-figure price and the commensurate gear that went along with them. But as I was to learn, their placement played a commanding role in allowing the system to achieve its potential. By applying what I learned that evening to other less expensive, extravagant speaker designs, I could similarly unleash their potential in ways that were new to me. My stereo by definition implies solidity and hence three dimensions. Properly done, the listener doesn't hear sound from the speakers, as we know. The sound occurs on a stage. On the finest recordings containing the information, you can hear depth well beyond the dimensions of the listening room. Now that I learned how to properly set up speakers so that they disappear, I saw new possibilities for the recordings themselves. I started doing experiments and I decided to use only two microphones. I only wanted one time signal per playback speaker. I didn't want to mix sounds arriving at different microphones in the same channel. So I decided I was going to do a two mic setup. And looking at the space between the speakers, I was considering the time element, and I thought the time it takes a sound to get from the left speaker's position to the right speaker's position should be reflected in the microphone placement. I thought there might be some reciprocity there. But when I made test recordings that way, I found that anything that was slightly off center tended to pull all the way to the extreme. So if something was just slightly to the left of center, it really sounded like it was far left. So that wasn't the answer. To get a stable stereo image without introducing time-based distortions that would come from adding more mics, like a central mic, I decided to try some iterative experiments in my listening room with my speaking voice. I think I got this from John Atkinson's first stereophile test disc, where he walked around the room identifying his position as he walked. So I did that. I walked around my room and tried different mic spacings. I had a wooden block that I was clicking on, and I would announce, I'm 1 foot to the left of center, 2 feet back, etc. I tried different positions and I tried different recordings, changing the mic spacing from the original 6 foot spacing that I used, trying different spacings all the way down to about 7 inches, about ear spacing. Somewhere around 16 inches or 15 inches, I felt the sound gelled. I think that was how I was going to start making my recordings from there. I started researching how our brains perceive stereo and the cues that we need for localization. And what I learned that our brains use 3 types of localization cues. They use level differences of sounds arriving at our ears, time arrival differences, and frequency differences. Our head, sound arriving from the left is the treble from it is blocked for the right ear by our heads. So I decided I wanted to incorporate all 3 types of localization cues in my recording. My thinking was that if nature could have gotten by with fewer than 3 types of cues, it would have done so. So I began to consider what I needed to supply all 3 types of cues. I know a lot of simple mic techniques, in my experience, are only applying 1 or 2 of these, but not all 3. So I designed an absorbent baffle, somewhat like a Jekyll disc, but instead of being locked into ear spacing, I used a microphone bar that allowed me to adjust the spacing to what I wanted. And at the 15 or 16 inch spacing with an absorbent baffle between the mics, I was able to capture all 3 types of cues that our brains use to localize sound. Now, while these experiments were going on, I was doing mastering for a number of labels, and a disturbing trend was making itself evident in that all too many A&R folks and producers were talking more about loudness. I can recall one producer who came up and said to me, how much do you usually raise the level of tapes that come in here? We do 6 dB. I wasn't sure how to reply to this because my experience taught me that sometimes you have to drop the level of a tape. I had received some tapes when I was at Atlantic where I had to drop the playback level about 6 or 7 dB just to avoid pinning the meters in the red. Other folks were requesting, I think the terms that were used was they wanted a balls to the wall sound. And I thought, ouch. These were the foundations of what came to be called the loudness wars, an arms race of sorts where folks wanted their record to be louder than everyone else's. There are folks who evaluated my mastering work with VU meters and not loudspeakers. My thinking was, oh, if it goes in the black, you lose. At this point, I had to stop and ask myself why I became an audio engineer and what I sought to accomplish with my work. I knew for sure that weaponizing sound and music wasn't among my goals. What a strange dichotomy, as I sought to create recordings that sounded more like life and had more dynamic range. The larger trend in the industry was to eviscerate dynamics, seeking ever greater quantity without regard to the cost and quality. Having considered my reasons for being an audio engineer, I decided to take a twofold approach. Those making mastering inquiries would now be asked how important final level was to them. Many benefits of achieving loudness with the playback volume control as opposed to the recorded level are explained, and those whose prime interest is in the quality of the music and sound tend to become clients. Those who really want loud records, I gently referred elsewhere to people that would make them happier. It's a personal decision. Second, my fascination with making records that sound like music itself, as opposed to simply sounding like records, was on the rise. And while mastering can be rewarding, I came to understand that, I came to believe that 90 or 95% of any recording's ultimate sound quality has already been determined by the time the signals are leaving the microphones. In other words, the overall quality is already there or not as soon as the signals enter the mic cables. Everything else is just relatively minor adjustments to the overall picture. So I made these three decisions. I was only going to master for quality-oriented clients, not level-oriented clients. I would move toward making original recordings, not just the mastering. And to do that, I had to design my own workplace and not rent time in different studios in town. So I got together with some friends and started building some acoustic treatments for the listening room. This guy in particular also owned the studio. His name is Art Halpern, and I'll have more to say about him going forward. But we built these cylindrical traps that address room modes, early reflections in the treble, and also provide diffusion. Not very different from the commercial tube traps. Other than in the cost. I built a room full for the price of one trap. Do they perform as well as the commercial variety? Maybe not, but they perform really well. Here we are covering them. Those are the first two finished traps. And as I brought these home, the system in that Honda never sounded as good as it did that day. And here they are in the mastering listening room that I used to have. I'm in a different one now. On the projection there, you're seeing a tool that I will talk about soon that does analysis of the audio 9 ways to Sunday. Not the upper left blue section, which is just an editor showing me the waveform of the music that's being evaluated by the rest of the screen there. I've been fortunate to hear some very capable loudspeaker designs over the years, and I have to say among my favorites are Jim Winey's Magnapans. I think I went from the Dahlquist to the 1.5s, then the 3.5s, 3.6, 3.7. I'm at the 3.7i now. And I think at the .7 series, they really made a beautiful jump upward in a blending of the different driver elements and the dynamic capabilities. Still not as much as those big reds in the studio, but I just found that I could really trust them. I found that they were pretty good at getting out of the way, and I believed what the speakers told me. Years later, much to my surprise, I had mentioned that a friend had brought over cables and speaker cables, and I found out that they made a difference to my ears for sure. So I spent a summer actually evaluating different cable candidates and also footers. And among all the cables I tried, I found that for my ears, the Nordos consistently stood out. And I brought them back to compare against others. And I ended up starting with their bottom of the line, which replaced cables that were triple their price. But they just seemed to be so much better at getting out of the way. And I needed them, if I was going to do mastering, I needed to hear what was in the recording, and rather than make adjustments to a recording to make the speakers sound right. That's something that, that's another thing I wanted to point out, that uncolored devices reveal the differences from recording to recording. Often audiophiles wonder, how do I know if I'm hearing what they heard in the studio? How do I know if the system is really transparent or not? And I think one of the best ways to tell if a system or component is transparent is the degree of difference you hear from recording to recording. Because every recording sounds really different from every other recording, even if it's made by the same engineer in the same room. That's been my experience. So the converse of that is there's some gear I've tried where every record I played had a certain similar characteristic in the treble. That's a coloration that the gear was adding. So the bigger the difference between recordings, the more transparent your component or system is. So between the combination of the Nordos and Magnepans, I found I had something I really liked. For recording and mastering work, it took a lot of the guesswork out of sonics, making adjustments. I could trust them and they would translate when I took them out to other systems, which is really important because those systems in the studio never seem to work out. People would often go out to their car to hear what it sounded like. And that was another, it's just something totally, how to describe it. You're just hearing the colorations of the different system. And as audiophiles, we want to try and get through that. At least that's my own aim, to hear the recording itself and not what the system is doing with it. So I still needed more pieces of gear if I was going to make my own recordings. And one day a musician I knew asked me if I ever heard of Spectrafoo. I never heard of Spectrafoo before, but it was a software tool for sonic analysis. And what you see on the screen there, other than the blue section in the upper left, is the Spectrafoo screen, a lot of the tools. That's currently being reworked because the version that was out is 32-bit and it won't run on more modern machines. So the designer is working on that right now. But through Spectrafoo, I became familiar with the company that made it, which is Metric Halo. I was looking at different interfaces to use for making recordings. I'd need a preamp for my microphones. I'd need an A to D converter and something that would bring that into the computer. And it turned out that in addition to software, Metric Halo made some very interesting hardware. They make 3 different pieces of hardware today. This is the first, and this is the one that I decided to buy. I did some auditions, and there was another one that I was considering, but once I auditioned this one, I just decided to buy it. It had 8 channels. One of the interesting things I find about this company is I believe this device first came out in 2002. I wasn't familiar with it until around 2005 or 2006. If you own one of these, they still provide updates for it. In fact, they're working on the latest update for it. So this is an unusual company in that they don't make their products obsolete. They just keep offering the updates for them to bring them up to the current standard. So I bought one of these, and then I had borrowed B&K microphones. I love their small diaphragm Omni microphones, like the Sheps microphones. I found them low coloration. But then I heard of these Earthworks microphones. QTC1s is the model. They're now called QTC40s. And they made the B&Ks sound colored by comparison. They're so fast. And unlike many microphones, they don't roll off at the bottom. They have a very wide bandwidth. I think these are pretty flat to 40K, which is why they call them the QTC40s. And they're pretty flat at around 4 cycles. This is really unusual for the microphones I've experienced over the years in studios. And they're Omnis, which I tend to find give me the most honest representation of what occurs in front of them. So I bought a matched pair of these. And then in 2006, I decided to start a label. And that's where Soundkeeper Recordings happened. And the goal was to provide the listener with a perspective that would be similar to what they experience in the presence of the performance. It's a departure from most of the records I grew up with and have enjoyed, but I see them as 2 different approaches, each with their own rewards. Having freed myself from working with loudness-oriented clients, and with the design of the studio and my setup complete, the results of the first 2 decisions had been made. What remained was to put the 3rd decision into effect, and it was time to make the first recording for what would be my new label. the person you saw in the image with the round traps earlier, Art Alperin, has a band, and he consented to allow his band to be recorded in this purist fashion without the convenience of studio for overdubs, fixing mistakes. And we needed a locale because the locale becomes an important part of a purist recording. It's an integral part of the sound rather than adding the space artificially or electronically. So Art knew about this old church in way upstate New York in the Catskills. And perhaps as an homage to another recording I knew that was recorded in the Catskills that I knew and loved, music from Big Pink, I decided if this recording worked, I was going to call it Music from Large Green. We gathered there. The musicians actually showed up the day before I got there for a rehearsal and promptly blew the power in the church. So we thought the session was over, but I decided to drive up there and see if there was anything I could do. As it turns out, there wasn't anything I could do, but one of the people in the band noticed another house several hundred feet away in the woods. And he happened to be a contractor who had many, many electrical extensions in the back of his Jeep. So Art went over and spoke to the people in the house, and they said, sure, you can connect to our kitchen for the power. So we had the session. Unfortunately, I was not pleased. The band wasn't pleased. I wasn't pleased with the results. So that did not become the first recording. I think my mics were way too far away from the band. I was thinking of the way classical music is often recorded. And they sounded like they were in the next town. So Art and I decided we would go back and do it again, rethinking this. And that became the first release on Soundkeeper Recordings. Art's band is called Work of Art. We named the recording Lift. Here's a view of the band inside the church. You can see the microphone array there with the baffle between the two microphones. And rather than being way back in the room, I realized that with Omnis, you can get pretty close. There's no doubt that removing the convenience of the studio and the safety it provides increases the pressure on the players as well as the engineer. Musical performances and the sonic balance all have to gel in specific ways for the recording to work. If one musician makes a mistake, the whole ensemble has to play it again. We're not going to punch in that bad note as we could in the studio. If the engineer doesn't get the balance right or some other aspect of the recording or performance is missed, we've got to do it again. With a pickup this sensitive, and these mics really are sensitive, other variables come into play as well. On one of the tracks, as the last chord of the song died away, there was a fly all the way at the back of the church, and the microphones could very clearly hear his buzzing. Unfortunately, he was not in the same key as the last chord, and the fly made us do another take. I refer to recording this way as recording without a net. Here's another view, a side view of the band and the microphone array. You can see the disc, the baffle that's between the microphones. It's absorbent foam. It's got a closed cell core and an open cell outer shell. Now, in the course of making these recordings, I learned that Metric Halo was updating its hardware, actually creating a new device. And in preparation for that, I sold the first box I had, the 2882, and they lent me one of their other models, the ULN2. This is just a 2-channel box with, I would say, probably more refined sounding microphone preamps than the 2882. I think the 2882 is wonderful, but the ULN2 shows how the mic preamps could be a little bit smoother. Now, both of these boxes maxed out at 96K. So Lift was done at 24-bit 96K. There is no higher version of it because I wouldn't want to do that. I'll bring the resolution down for CD, etc., but not. I don't want to upsample it because it's not. You'd still be hearing the 96K basically. So that release was done there, and with there were also new microphone cables that I got to try. Previously, I'd been using Mogami microphone cables, these pro cables, the best I'd heard. And I got a set of Nordos Valkyra cables to use with the microphones. And I thought there was a sense of diminished grain and increased definition. The sound was less bright, but more open and extended, more coherent. I think I was hearing my microphones being better than I thought they were. So this album was done with 2 different boxes, 2 different interfaces, and 2 different sets of mic cables, half done in one session. There were 2 sessions. So for the second session, we had the slightly different gear. There's a good shot with a little more light of a simpler song with just 3 instruments. Art in the center, singing and playing guitar. For the next project, I came to discover what's one of the hardest parts of having a label, finding the venue with the right acoustic for the instrumentation isn't easy. Neither is coordinating the schedules of everyone involved. Certainly producing, engineering, and mastering are labor intensive, as is the selection and preparation of the album artwork, coding the web pages for the Soundkeeper website, which I also do, and getting the word out to reviewers and customers. But none has proven as difficult as finding artists to record. Of course, the artist's music has to interest me. That part's relatively easy. The tough part is finding artists whose music moves me and who are capable of making a recording the Soundkeeper way. People are so used to studios and being able to fix things. It feels like a rarity to encounter players who can, as I often put it, play a 5-minute piece in 5 minutes. In fact, the fact that many require a few hours to accomplish this makes the patchwork approach used for most recordings a more practical means of recording them. But in my experience, the best way to achieve the excitement of a real performance is to record a real performance. So it was a few years passed after the first Soundkeeper recording with no new artists on the label. And one evening at a social gathering, a friend asked me if I'd ever heard of Marcus Schwartz. I had not. In the months before our recording date, I finally received the new Metric Halo box, which is the one I currently use today. This is the ULN-8. I wish more audiophile magazines would review their products and expand their audience. There is a learning curve in the setup, and for years they have been primarily Mac only, but they are moving to where they can be used on other computer platforms. And I just love the sound. I've never heard anything that approaches it, much less bests it. I haven't heard everything. And of course, I'm only speaking for my own ears, but I had this gear ready to go. And this gear also allows me to go at 192. So the next project was going to be at 192K, and I've done everything at 24, 192 since then. But I went out to hear Marcus and his band at a local club. This, by the way, what you're seeing on the screen is the interface of what is the console, the software associated with the ULN-8. It basically is, it's custom designed. You can have as many channels as you want, as many inputs as you want. And there's a separate window for recording, which you see in some of the shots from the sessions. But with that in mind, I had all this gear. I wanted a larger space for this ensemble. I went out to see them play live, and right away I was taken by them. And I approached them at a break and spoke with the players and said, you know, I asked, how would you like to listen to your favorite percussionist with your ears right on the drums, or your favorite guitar player with your ear up against the grill cloth of the amplifier, or your favorite trumpet player with your ear at the bell of the horn? No one wanted that. And I said, well, that's where the microphones in typical recordings listen from. So I want to try a different approach. And they were all interested. They said, let's make a recording. So I had to find a space that was appropriate. I think the church that I used in the earlier recording would have been too reverberant for something with all this percussion. And there was a trumpet in this band as well, a trumpet and flugelhorn. This is a view of the room. A friend of mine was working in healthcare and got a position at an assisted living facility in Westchester. The place was more like a very fancy hotel. And she asked me to come see the place. So I went to see it, and at the end of the room, at the end of the hallway, was this auditorium that dropped my jaw. It was built in 1908. There was a Steinway on the stage that was immaculate. And interestingly, the stage, on most stages in most rooms that I've been in, if you stomp your foot, you hear the hollowness of the stage. This one was like stomping your foot on a rock. I think somehow they put stone in here. So whoever built this room did a beautiful job. And I asked for permission to use this facility to make a recording. And in exchange, the artist would do a performance for the residents of the facility. So we worked out that barter arrangement. And I did the next 3 recordings in this facility. Here you're seeing the what I call ground control. You can see the record panel with the 2 channels, the green and red. In a prior recording, this is between takes, and the guitarist in the band was on the stage just relaxing. I did a session with these guys and they played wonderfully, but actually, let me go back to that previous slide. I felt that they were a little bit cautious, maybe because they were used to typical studio recordings. I let the band hear playbacks, and I believe they're not used to hearing the amount of information of themselves that they could hear coming from those Earthworks mics and the rest of the setup. You could hear spit in the horn, and the horn player was 8 feet away from the mics. He was actually to the left of this position during the takes. But we decided to have a second session, and before the session, I asked the band to avoid being cautious and to take the word play seriously and just to have fun with it, just to kind of throw caution to the winds. And amazingly, this time they nailed it. In fact, it could be a world record. The total time for unpacking the gear, setting up, doing a sound check, warming up, recording, taking a break, recording some more, and breaking it all down was 4 hours. We had an album at the end of 4 hours. This is very different. At Atlantic, I was used to bands spending days getting the reverb on the snare drum. But I was really happy with the way this recording came out. And I was hoping to get reviews. And much to my joy, my shock and elation, Stereophile in the February 2011 issue made that recording their recording of the month. I can't describe the thrill there. Just amazingly wonderful. So we come to the 3rd Soundkeeper recording. In the summer of 2008, I received an inquiry about mastering a self-recorded album from a singer-songwriter in New York City. In what became standard practice, I asked him, how important overall level was to him. And he told me he was interested in musical dynamics. So I asked to hear some samples, and I ended up really liking his album and his music. So I mastered it. And then I talked to him about doing a Soundkeeper project, because I thought he's totally original. Doesn't sound like anyone else I've ever heard. His lyrics are literate. Music is complex. I really liked his singing voice. So he had to find a band, though, because his first recording was him playing all the parts and singing all the parts, all done at home. But that wouldn't work for a Soundkeeper recording. So he spent 2 years auditioning players, finally got a band together, and we went back to that same room and recorded a very complex album. There's so much music on it. I called it a double album, even though it was on a CD. There were solo piano songs, duets, a trio with a cello and a French horn, full ensemble pieces. There was a piece that had guitar, piano, electric bass, drums, cello, French horn, Celeste, a real instrument, not a keyboard. There was an electric guitar quartet, maybe the first Purist rock recording with no PA. I don't know. But this was probably the hardest recording I ever made, because once you get a sound check with a band, you can pretty much go through the whole record. Here, every song was a different band. And there was an interesting thing that came up with Jason's solo piano recordings. Usually when you hear a vocalist with solo piano, the recording places the vocal in the middle, and then the piano is spread between your stereo speakers. I wanted something that represented more like what a listener present at the performance would hear. So Jason sat at the Steinway grand piano, and of course, when he's sitting at a piano on the stage, with the piano open toward the audience, he's to the left of center. So I decided that his vocals would come from where he was on the stage, and that's how we recorded him. There are 4 songs on the album that are vocal and solo piano. And then here's some other shots from that session. Here you can see a little bit more of that room, that wonderful room. The next project was done in that room. The bass player who played on Equinox with Marcus Schwartz had his own band. And I was really impressed with his melodic sense, his overall inventiveness, his stamina as a player. And as we talked, it turned out that the US State Department and Jazz at Lincoln Center had sent his band on a kind of a cultural tour of Central and South America. And while they were there, they learned music from each of the places. So Paul, the bass player and leader of the band, expressed an interest in capturing some of the things they learned. So that was what we recorded. The album became America's. And this was a recording of a jazz quartet, one of my favorite musical constellations. Almost 8 years after we released the first release, Art and I decided to do a follow-up to Lift. And I must say, one story I forgot to tell was when I met Art, he came to me, he had called me and asked if I was the guy that mastered the Bob Marley catalog, because he had a reggae album that he was working on. And I said I was, and we met at a studio I had rented for the day. I didn't have my own studio at the time. And at the session, Art said to me how much consideration I give to final level when I master. And I looked at him and I said, none whatsoever. And he stayed, which was wonderful. We became friends. And then he offered his band when I first wanted to start Soundkeeper. So 8 years after Lift, Art had written a bunch of new songs. We decided to get together again. And I found the right locale. I found another church, a 19th century church with a lot of wood and a very warm acoustic that I thought was well suited to his band. Here is ground control, a view in the church of the software at that time and the ULN-8 below. I've commented before on how great the feel is in Art's music, and it pleased me to no end when the reviews came back and people listened to it. Everyone seemed to use the same word. When my wife heard it, she said, this is such a joyful recordings. And other people used the same word. They found joy in listening to this Winds of Change album by Art. Thelonious Monk came up several times when I was discussing another Soundkeeper project with Marcus Schwartz. Marcus turned me on to the beauty of Haitian music, and I really wanted to do another project with him and his band. So in 2017, I proposed doing a follow-up to Equinox, which was, again, Stereophile's recording of the month in February 2011, and perhaps the best-selling Soundkeeper recording to date. Marcus had been thinking about Thelonious Monk and wanted to incorporate some of his music into the project. We went back to the same church in which I'd done Work of Art's Winds of Change album. A few changes to the band. Monvolino Alexi is still playing guitar, but the horn player was now Godwin Louis, another Haitian player, and also another Haitian player on bass, Bobby Raymond joined, replacing Paul Baudry for this outing. Godwin is an exceptional player. He was a graduate of the Thelonious Monk Institute for Jazz Performance, was a finalist in the Thelonious Monk Institute for Jazz Saxophone competition. For this session, also Bobby Raymond joined us on bass. And here's a view from behind Marcus's position, looking out into the church with the mic array. The material included a number of traditional Haitian tunes, some augmented by music and lyrics from Monvolino. The band played 2 tracks by Thelonious Monk, Baya and a Haitian version of Epistrophe. And when Marcus and I listened to the playbacks in my studio, we had trouble deciding which of the 2 takes of Baya to include in the album. But I decided let's include one as a bonus track. So that came through. Every session has its special moments. And while this one holds many great memories for me, one particular instance stands out as a perfect illustration of the power of music. Early in the session, the band played a track called Minis Azaka, a traditional Haitian song with original lyrics and music from Monvolino sung in Haitian Creole. I found myself standing and swaying to the music as we recorded it. And as Monvolino sang the lyrics in a language I don't speak or understand, I stood there wiping tears from my eyes. When the take was over, I told the band it was the most beautiful piece of music I had the good fortune to record. And I was still wiping my eyes when Marcus informed me that the lyrics are powerful and sad. I didn't see the translation until many weeks after the session, but in the moments they played it, without my understanding the words, the music and Monvolino's vocal performance spoke to me in a profound way. I think it was Jeff Buckley who once said, music isn't merely an art form, it's a force of nature. So we come to the latest Soundkeeper recording. I first heard of the Cosmic American Derelicts from a friend who knows I'm always looking for artists to record. He knows I seek musicians whose work I not only enjoy, but who are amenable to what I call the recording without a net process. So I checked out the band's website and a number of videos, and I found myself taken by their songs, some plaintive, others joyful. by their voices, by their playing. I exchanged several emails with the band leader, who's the bassist, George Capitanellis. And when George confirmed the band's interest, the search for the optimal recording venue ensued. And therein lies a story of its own. Mark, I noticed you used this as your background picture. How nice. I'd recently relocated to more rural environs of rolling hills dotted with farms. And since the music for this project is country bluegrass oriented, I thought it appropriate to record these voices and acoustic string instruments in the intimate, woody atmosphere of a barn. What better place to record country music than in the country? While there's no shortage of barns in this area, the COVID-19 pandemic was rampant, and I was more than hesitant to approach folks, much less undertake a recording, until I was fully vaccinated. Around this time, I heard about one farm that had a history of association with music as well as other creative endeavors. So a few months later, after I received the vaccine, I went to visit. The place is widely known as the Silo or Hunt Hill Farm, and it's in the National Register of Historic Places. The farm was active for close to 300 years when it was acquired half a century ago by musician Skitch Henderson. Many of you may remember Henderson as the founder of the New York Pops. He was the musical director at NBC and was the original band leader on The Tonight Show. Skitch and his wife Ruth operated the farm as an art gallery, cooking school, and museum. In 2003, they partnered with conservation groups in the local town to found the Hunt Hill Farm Trust as a nonprofit organization, according to Wikipedia, to preserve the farm's land and buildings and celebrate Americana in music, art, and literature through the creation of a living museum. They sought to make the place an artistic center for the community. There were cooking schools there where named chefs would come by. And years after the Hendersons passed away, the board, despite their best efforts, determined the funds were insufficient to cover the expenses, and the farm was closed down. No more named chefs teaching at the school, no more famous show business folks and musicians visiting the farm. Much was put up for auction. What would have been a sad ending was turned around less than a year later when Alessandro Piovazan and his wife Danielle entered the picture. Although they were not previously familiar with the Hendersons or the Silo, they wanted a place to raise their family and provide the community with a space that fostered the arts. Alessandro's in the process of donating the farm to the Hunt Hill Farm Trust, a nonprofit created by the Hendersons, but now controlled by Piovazan as chairman of the board of directors and pro bono CEO. His vision is to restore the Hendersons' legacy. A cooking school is set to return. There are various art exhibits, walking trails on the land are going to be rebuilt, and there are already regular concerts and public events there. As the first of a number of possible recording spaces, when I visited, Alessandro showed us was the largest barn there. There are several. It had been used as a performance space, exhibit space for art, even as a hall for weddings. And while the room was fine, it was a bit more reverberant than I wanted. It would probably be great for a large choral ensemble, but I wanted something more intimate. The next building he showed us was a barn built in 1820, which is what you're looking at in the image here. As soon as I entered the place, I knew this was it. Part of the building is where Alessandro and his family live. There's a back section that you don't see in the photo. This is where the Hendersons lived when they were here. But aside from the living quarters, what was long ago a farmyard barn housed this room, which is now part of the museum. Up in the loft, there are other musical instruments, including an 1862 Vocalion pipe organ. The main floor is home to one of the world's most famous 9-foot Steinway grands, known as the Old 199. This was the piano Henderson played on The Tonight Show and at Carnegie Hall when he led the Pops. The instrument has been played by Gary Groffman, Vladimir Horowitz, Sergei Rachmaninoff, Elton John, and John Lennon. The room had exactly the qualities I wanted. It was primarily made of wood with a quite short reverberation time and lots of air. So when I was working out the rental fee with Alessandro, he added a condition I wasn't prepared for, but which made me smile and admire him more than I already did. Aside from the financial arrangement, he asked me to provide 100 pounds of non-perishable food to be delivered to the local food bank. It turns out that in addition to his community orientation regarding the arts and a place where folks can enjoy nature, Alessandro's intent on feeding the hungry. And I later found out that providing some amount of non-perishable food is part of all the events that occur at the Silo. I thought, what an unbeatable combination, promoting the arts, providing a place to commune with nature, and feeding the hungry. So this is the first view of the setup inside the barn with the band getting ready to play. This again is what I call ground control, the UL-8 on the left, the Mac laptop on the right, with the metric halo console, and in front of that, the smaller window is the record panel. So when the band arrived, I got there early to meet the band as they arrived. And when they entered the barn, each member had the same reaction I did when they saw it. Eyes wide, mouth smiling. And they realized this is no ordinary barn, no dirt floor or animals anymore. Instead, a fine finished wooden floor, comfortable furniture, grand piano. Up in the loft, the pipe organ and other instruments. Under the loft, a small kitchen with a refrigerator where I place snacks and cold water to sustain us. We moved a few small pieces of furniture, and then we were ready to record. And here's a few views. There are videos on the Soundkeeper webpage for this album, recorded on my iPhone. Some of those videos, at least one of them, became the final take. So you can see the video that goes along with it. And then this is the room I currently use, where I evaluate the recordings and create the final masters. A lot of people question high resolution and is it necessary? I've heard DACs that perform worse at 192 than they do at 96. And I think I attribute that to the fact that it's easier to make a claim on a spec sheet than to design the product to back it up. But in an effort to help, I've created a format comparison page on the Soundkeeper website. This is a view of the current homepage. And under the More menu, there's a format comparison option. I know in the past when new formats have come out and demos are made, I've often heard extreme level differences. Often one format is mastered by one engineer, the other by another. So I'm comparing masterings. I'm no longer comparing only the formats themselves. I think for a fair comparison, only one variable should be different. So what I did was, for each of the Soundkeeper albums, there are 3 samples, except for the first, which was recorded only at 96. So that has samples at 96 and at 1644. But for each of the other albums, there are 3 samples that are downloadable. The original 24-192, the 24-96 reduction, and the 1644 reduction. And I figure this way, people can compare them for themselves, all from the same mastering session. The only variable is the resolution of the recording. Yeah, as I've said to people, if you don't hear a difference and you want the album, buy the least expensive one. But the option is there. It's that format comparison page that you can find, and all these samples are downloadable. They're the first 3 minutes of the track in WAV format. You're downloading a zip file when you click the link, and then unzip it and you'll have a WAV file. And you can compare for yourself. Links, here's the Soundkeeper website. There's a blog where much of what I've told you today is in the various entries over time. And then there's a site I created originally when I went independent from Atlantic. And I thank you for listening. I hope some of this was of interest. I really appreciate your listening. I hope you enjoy some of the Soundkeeper recordings, the music and the sound, and get to know some of these artists. I know they turn me on musically. I've recorded a chamber ensemble, and there have been other recordings that I tried, but they just didn't work out for musical or sonic reasons. I love all kinds of music. I hope to release all kinds of music on the label in time. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. During your presentation, Tom Fine had a question, and I promised I would give him first dibs on asking something.
Yes. Barry, that was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you please explain how the Loudness Wars got started? It just never made any sense to me because of FM processing, and why people felt that was necessary, since the FM stations for pop and rock were compressing the hell out of the levels anyway.
I'm with you 100%. I don't know exactly. I think my first experience of them actually happened in the vinyl world, when I found a lot of vinyl mastering engineers were, you'd establish a level that you would cut the vinyl at. And what they would do is make the first 30 seconds or so much louder or considerably louder, so that when the producer dropped the stylus at the front of the record, he would be pleased at how loud it was. And then they would slowly cheat the volume down. With a lot of records from the 70s, about 30 seconds in, it almost sounds like the song is fading out. And it's not fading out, but it is fading down to the level that would allow the engineer to not run out of land. If you keep cutting that loud, you'll reach the end of land and where the label is before the end of the musical program. Of course, once digital happened, people could take their level to what I take to be insane degrees. And it was a matter of competition. It was competing quantity over quality. Yeah, radio was going to squash it anyway. And then, and nowadays with the levelizing software, it makes those compressed records sound really thin and wimpy as they are. But yeah, in terms of the beginnings of it, I remember the beginnings of it in the vinyl days. It just went totally nuts once digital happened.
When I used to supervise TV mixes, like one of the places was at the mix place where actually Bob Fine worked for a time. I noticed that at a certain level of compression, if you're just using an old-fashioned tube compressor, it starts to get fuzzy. So you were sort of limited by how much compression you could use. And then when people started to use Pro Tools and digital audio workstations, and then started to use digital compressors, in a way, the fuzziness went away, but other artifacts started showing up. But engineers learned they could really crank up the compression, and it wasn't obviously fuzzy and distorted like you would get with a tube compressor. Is there anything to that theory of mine?
Over the years, I think what was developed was the multi-band compressors, where you're not compressing the whole signal. You can separate and compress the bass and the lower mid-range and the upper mid-range and the treble all separately with different degrees of compression. I think those are the most common ones in use today. And perhaps they're allowing the additional level without getting into that total fuzziness.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we might get back to more compression questions, but Arnie, go ahead.
Can I just say something?
Oh yeah, you may. Absolutely.
I think you're correct in that the digital tools are more surgical, right? And what Barry's saying is more, it's more practical in the digital world to do these very specific bandpass compression things. And it's the same with EQ. The band that you're working with EQ can be more surgical with a digital filter. It doesn't, in my opinion, super squashing anything, no matter how you do it, does not make it better. With TV commercials, it's a different thing. You want them to be as loud as possible. And in fact, at the mix place, my father invented a compressor that was super, you could watch the VU meter go to no movement, but the voice wouldn't pump. And that was one of the secret sauce things they had there, which they wanted. But anyway, for music, it's not good. And I never understood why the drummers surrendered, because the squashing just kills the drums the most of everything. And I've never met a band where the drummer would want to surrender to the guitar player, but that's basically what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Tom. Arnie, go ahead.
Yeah, well, Barry, thanks a lot for a wonderful presentation. I now have more respect for you than ever because of what you said and what you demonstrated. So again, thank you. The question is that it's a very simple. Do you have a preference for a DAC and a power amplifier that you use for your playback?
My DAC is the ULN8, the Metric Halo.
Oh, that's a DAC also.
It's a DAC. It's a headphone amp. It's microphone preamps. It's a recording device. And in each of these categories, I have to say, for my ears, it's the best I've heard. Not that long after I got the ULN8, somebody I met through an audio forum brought over another device that I thought was probably going to be the best DAC in the world, designed by engineers I respect. I don't want to mention the brand. it had what I described earlier about transparency. It applied the same treble character to everything that went through it. When the ULN-8 came out, one of the people in the user group, the Metric Halo user group, is a mastering engineer on the West Coast who is involved with the tape project. And what he did was use 8 different ADCs, 8 different analog to digital converters, and made samples of rock, classical, and jazz from analog sources, and then gave them to the group. So all we knew was this was converter set A, converter set B, so on. And each set had these 3 encodings from the analog sources. And it's probably the only time in my life I've ever experienced anything like unanimity among audio folks. You know how we all have our own opinions. And, you know, as I said, you ask 3 people, you get 4 different answers. The overwhelming majority, I think it was almost everyone involved in these listening tests, picked the ULN-8. To this day, I've not heard a DAC I like more. One of the things that impressed me most about it, and then that impresses me most about 192 that I don't hear people talk about, is the bottom end. People often talk about the treble, but the ULN-8, particularly at 192, does bass differently from other electronic devices I've heard. It sounds more like, I don't know how to describe it. It just sounds more like bass in real life to me than electronically derived bass. And that's why I say I wish one of these magazines would review their gear. I don't know if they provide it to reviewers. But yeah, so it also serves as my DAC, and it's a preamp also, and it'll do phono EQ if you have a turntable. It just does everything. It's I was fortunate to meet the designer of this, and I think, like Keith Johnson and Tom Colangelo, I think he's a true genius. BJ Buckhalter is his name. He's an audio genius. And, you know, having a 15-minute conversation with the guy, you leave feeling like you aced a 3-credit class in whatever it was you were talking about because you learned so much. So I'm very impressed with the work he does and with this box. So that's my DAC.
What about the power amp?
The power amp. Nothing special with the power amp. I'm just using, I've always felt that with a limited budget, the power amp was where I was going to save the money. Would my Magnapan sound better with a better power amp than what I'm using? They probably would. I would bet that they would. I'm just using outlaw power amps, mono power amps that are delivering 300 watts aside to the Maggies. So that was where I economized in the purchase of the system.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Right. Thanks, Barry. Don, I put you off before, so go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. First, it's an excellent presentation. Barry, how much or who makes the ULN-8? How much does it cost to buy one? And do you know if there's a waiting time, a waiting list to get my hands on one of them?
The ULN-8 is made by Metric Halo. They've moved from Westchester County or in New York to Florida. When it first came out, I think the ULN-8 sold for $5,000. It's now $3,000. However, there is a version of the ULN-8 that does not have the microphone preamps built in. It's called the LIO-8. It's the same box, but no microphone preamp boards, and they can be added later, 4 at a time, either for just 4 or 8. So if you want to save money, I don't know the exact current price of the LIO-8, but if you don't need microphone preamps, that gets you the same box without the mic preamps at a lower price.
Oh, nice. But it still has ADC and DAC and programmable
headphone amp, and also the built-in software. Again, there's a learning curve, know that. And right now it's easiest to use on a Mac, although he is working on getting it to other platforms. But one of the EQ options is an RIAA decode. So you can feed a phono cartridge into it and have it do the decoding.
Nice.
One other thing I should say about the ULN-8 and the, well, there are phone jack outputs. There's a pair of those, but most of the connectors, in order to fit that many channels and that many connectors on the back, are DB25s. So I made special adapters to connect my microphones to those, so I could use the mic cables I want to use rather than buy commercial snakes.
Thanks. Next up for the questions, Steve, go ahead.
Wonderful, great. Barry, God bless, man. So good to hear you. Thank you for being here today. I'm here with my friend George. We've been working with, we've been following your audio blog, and we've been using the tire tubes, and now I'm using springs. George has a question for you, Barry. Yeah, George.
Yeah, Barry, thanks for being here. We both have really gotten great results with the vibration isolation techniques that you've talked about. And we both started out with the bicycle tire inner tube method, and got pretty good results. The most amazing thing was drilling a hole through the concrete block and having the whole system sound differently, just an 1/8-inch hole. But recently, I'm an engineer, so I calculated some springs that would have a resonant frequency of 2 hertz for Steve's system. And he got them. He's getting really great
Amazing results, Barry. Amazing results from the springs.
I can't help but be curious with the bicycle inner tube air spring system. Is there a way of calculating the resonant frequency that you would have?
I don't have one. I just set it so that there's only enough air to lift the load, so it's not resting on the inflation valve. I find one pump too many and you start to bloat the bass. In terms of what the resonance frequency is there, I don't know. I mean, I can press down on the platform on my rack and release it and watch it spring.
Right.
I don't know what it is.
I think the mathematics are very complicated, and it's not like an easy calculation with a coil spring is, you know.
Yes, yeah, the spring you probably have much more control.
Yeah, the coil springs are very easy to figure out. It turns out if you select springs that give you 3 inches of static deflection, you're getting about 1.8 hertz, which I think is a pretty good low resonant frequency. And he got great results recently with that.
And I did it to my speakers and to my subwoofer, and Barry, it's unbelievable. The transformation of the sound stage and the timbre, everything.
Yeah, but
it's almost like the system is ungagged.
Yeah, exactly.
Good isolation.
And I just built new paracords, unbelievable. Silver-plated Ono continuous cast paracords with high-grade copper with silver, and then palladium, not palladium, what was the other stuff called?
The plating you're talking about?
Yeah, the plating, the silver, rhodium plated.
Rhodium plated,
power plugs and IECs. Unbelievable differences to silver from just the plain copper. Unbelievable.
So guys, what you could put in the chat, the cables you're referring to, and for people to check out after the meeting. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
And Charles Repka, you're next up with your hand up. Thank you. Go ahead and unmute.
I heard most of the presentation, a good part of the presentation, while on my way to my recording gig where I am now. And I caught the part where he said that listening at 192 made audible differences in the bass, which sort of defies engineering logic. I also have an engineering degree and spent the latter half of my career working for NBC and ABC, making measurements in their engineering lab. So I have a ton of test measurement experience. But 2 stories. One, back when I was working at Vanguard Records, we had a monitoring room, a QC room, where we would listen to everything. And we'd have an AB switch that could switch between the master tape and the test pressing. And it went to a little amplifier box underneath that was connected to the switches that had these op amps in there. They were molded block plug-in op amps. So one day we swapped out one op amp manufacturer for another. Direct plug-in. They measured the same, that the best we could measure back then. And switching back and forth, the first thing we notice is one of them had more bass than the other. Go back and make your measurements again. You couldn't measure any difference, okay? Time goes on. I had a very good friend by the name of John Moravskis, who built subwoofers. And he also had a degree in physics and made all kinds of measurements on his products that he made. And he also did listening experiments. And one of the things that he discovered and proved to me that humans can hear with pink noise and with music, people can hear 1/10 of a dB difference. He did these measurements by making using narrowband pink noise and getting test subjects and switching back and forth between things and making changes. And people could discern 1/10 of a dB difference. Nobody measures to 1/10 of a dB. And I'm just wondering if what you're hearing is very slight changes in bass response that is being ignored by most measurements. So I do not summarily dismiss that things that measure the same can't sound different. They do. We just aren't measuring fine enough, or we still don't know what to measure.
What I described was more of a qualitative difference than a quantitative difference. So I have no explanation for it. I just know.
But there was an audible difference, and it was in the lower frequencies. And it clearly switched with the op amp that measured between two op amps that measured the same. And, you know, and then years later, I tied it together that it was subtle differences that we don't measure fine enough.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah. And of course, sometimes what audiophiles, a small level difference, audiophiles will perceive as something other than a level difference. And that's pretty well known, and why you should, if you're doing an A/B comparison, you know, match to a quarter of a dB, 1/10 of a dB. I don't know. That's interesting. Yeah,
I mean, I didn't believe him either until I sat down and did the test and sure enough, I could hear 1/10 of a dB difference. So, you know, something to think about.
All right, thank you. Don, did you have another question?
Yeah, I have a follow-up. So I went to the Metric Halo website, MH Secure, and I see the $3,000 or $4,000. Am I to believe that for that amount of money, I can buy a DAC for me to use at home for home listening that's going to be as good or better than these $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 DACs that are made by brand names that are, you know, recognizable in the magazines and such?
That's a tough question to answer. I can only speak for my own response, what I've heard and what I've listened to. I've compared it to devices that cost considerably more, and I'm still using this. I'm using this because I thought it outperformed them. But, you know, I don't know if you would hear it the same way. I can only speak for how I hear it. You mentioned $4,000. That's probably, is that for the LI08? Because I know the ULN8's about I thought it was about $3,000 now, and the LI08 would be less.
$4,000 looks like is their most expensive item that I see on their website. I think they've got 3 things there. So I'm just.
When you look at the ULN8, make sure it's without mic preamps, because they sell different. They'll sell it with 4 preamps and with 8 preamps. So you might see that's the LI08. You might see 3 different prices for that box.
Doing a quick Google search here, I'm seeing prices vary from $2,500 to $2,900. So, and it may be that the $2,900 is with the mic preamp. I'm not sure, but I see several available for $2,500.
I can't speak to how other people will respond to it. Someone may hear it and say, oh, I can't listen to this. It's terrible, but I love it. So I can only speak from my own ears.
So I have a question or a subject I wanted you to comment on. You used to comment on this on audiophile forums and computer audio forums, which you generally don't do anymore because they've become an S show. And I know you had said that with the metric halo at 24.192, it's essentially transparent, and you can switch between the analog mic feed and the analog output of the metric halo, having gone through 24.192 and not hear a difference. Do you still find that to be the case?
I do still find that to be the case. I think usually when that's happened to me in the past, it only changes when I hear something better and I go, I missed that. But I've not yet heard that. I have heard it with the metric halo at 1644, very recently, in fact. I mentioned that they constantly upgrade, and they offer the upgrades for the older boxes. So I've changed the cards inside my ULN8 twice. Most recently, just a couple of months ago, with what they call their Mark IV update, which is not yet for the two smaller boxes, but they will be coming. That Mark IV update made the items on the soundstage at 1644 more solid to my ears. They just had more meat to them, for lack of a better way to put it, more convincingly there. So prior to that, the ULN8 at 1644 was the best I heard 1644. Not transparent to the mic feed the way I feel about it at the 4x rates at 192. So far, I've not yet found the difference. If it's there, maybe I'll find it someday.
And interestingly, you think at 2496, you can hear a difference. And I used to argue with Arnie Balgalvis about this, that like, it's pointless to do this 24.192 stuff. And you said, no, you hear it immediately dropping down to 24.96. And I was skeptical until I heard a couple of your recordings in the comparison that I downloaded from your website, and also a couple of tracks from the 2L Nordic Sound site where they give you free downloads at various resolutions.
Wonderful recordings, yeah.
And they're just beautiful. But when I heard like the violins on the 2L stuff, and you hear the 24.192 versus the 24.96, I just couldn't believe it, that like, oh my God, I'm hearing it, which made me feel good. But I was skeptical until you really compare like with with a really good Purist recording, and you do hear it. To me, I've played it for other people, and although I'm very sensitive to placebo effects, and I don't trust my ears unless I can really consistently blind hear the difference. And I felt like with your recordings and with the 2L recordings, I could do that in a blind test situation. Anyway, Arnie, I'm sorry, you had your hand up.
Yeah, Barry, one more thing. What about DSD? What are your thoughts on DSD?
I have a couple of DSD recordings. I've never been moved to switch to it for my recordings. I don't know, there's something about it. It's very nice sounding, and I know a lot of people with ears I respect say it's the cat's meow, but it just, there's something about it that bothers me, and I haven't been able to put my finger on it. There's something about it that makes me uncomfortable. Not in some great way like CD in 1983, but there's just, I don't know what it is. And yet, I have some 2L recordings and they're fabulous. But I don't know. I don't know what the words are. Again, it's just my opinion. Maybe I'm totally off base. It's always a possibility, but there's something about it that hasn't swayed me from PCM at 192. And I know, like I say, a lot of people with ears I respect feel very differently about that. But that's what makes the audio world go round. I wanted to address one thing also, if I may, that came up earlier from you, Arnie, regarding the different CD pressings. And one thing I neglected to say in my presentation was when I formed Soundkeeper, having at Atlantic sent CD masters to plants all over the United States and all over the world, I spoke with a lot of CD plants to choose the one that was going to do the Soundkeeper CDs. And every plant but one said to me, oh, our CDs are going to sound exactly like the master you send in. Now, I already said I never heard a CD that sounds like the master I sent to the plant. Only one plant said to me, oh, they'll never sound like the master. He got the job right away, but I asked him to explain, and I asked him what they did. And this may account for some of the differences when playing a CD in a CD player. He said, for one thing, when they cut the glass, which is they take a CD master at the replication facility, is first etched onto a glass disc with a laser cutter, a laser beam recorder, I think they're called. From that, they make the intermediate steps that ultimately make the mold, the injection molding. But he said what they do is they cut the glass. Other companies have started to cut the glass at high speed. And I found this in burning CDRs early on. It's less true today, but early on I found that if I burnt a CDR, a music CDR at one time, it sounded better than if I burned it at high speed. So he said one of the things they do at this plant is they cut their glass masters in real time. The other thing is the injection molding cycle, he told me, at most plants nowadays is about 4 seconds long. They use a 9-second long injection molding cycle, theoretically, to let the material flow better in the mold. So maybe that impacts the shape of the pits, the integrity of the pit to land transitions. I can't say for sure. I can say that when I compare one of this facility's CDs to the master I sent out, I can only hear a difference if I do a direct AB. And then it's very, very subtle. But they make the best CDs I've heard. And his explanation to me is the real-time cutting of the glass and the longer injection molding cycle, neither of which are very common among CD plants today. So maybe that has some bearing.
Yeah, great. Very good information. Thank you.
Gary, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, Mike Patterns, Barry, did you say you're using closely spaced omnis?
They're spaced about 15, 16 inches apart. They are small diaphragm omnis.
Have you ever tried the MS type of recording mid-side?
Yes, I have. I found that again, for my ears, it didn't give me back the same image that I can get with the omnis at this kind of spacing with a baffle between them. It's essentially using a cardioid microphone for the middle and a figure-8 microphone sideways for the side information. And I haven't yet heard a cardioid mic that didn't have a color of its own. It just doesn't, to my ears, again, it doesn't get out of the way as much as a small diaphragm omni does. It's a subjective call.
A side benefit of MS recording that I have found, if you play it back in surround sound, just about any of the decoders, you get an almost discrete surround sound recording for free. It's really amazing.
Huh. I know I have used MS processing when mastering. Sometimes I've gotten a master in where there were issues, let's say at the sides, but not in the middle, or just in the middle, but not at the sides. And by taking the stereo program, breaking it up into MS, I can process independently. So I can process the middle and leave the sides alone, process the sides and leave the middle alone, and then join them back into stereo for the final master that I send out. So I've used MS processing that way.
I've tried that too, taking apart a regular stereo recording and then into M and S.
Mhm.
And then if I put a little bit more S in it, it widens the sound stage or turns it into surround. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, you can totally adjust the width of the stereo image that way with the balance of the mid to side. I think I forgot who made the electronics in the old days. There was some receiver or amplifier that had a control, I believe, called Panorama, that I think achieved the same thing. You could widen the stereo image by adding more difference signal, or make it narrower by making the proportion of the sum signal stronger.
Thank you.
Yeah, I recently, the label will remain nameless, but somebody sent me the same recording, but with MS processing or just straight stereo. So I don't quite understand it, but the MS processing that the engineer did definitely put sound outside of the loudspeakers. And I thought, well, this is pretty cool. Why doesn't everybody do this? But as you say, it might be that you just prefer a different mic, that you don't like the cardioid that would be required for MS. Is that what you're saying?
Well, for recording, but MS processing can be used after the fact to hyper widen the image if that was desired.
So like that in your digital audio workstation, that can be done no matter what the mic was in the first place.
Exactly. Whether it's anything from multi-mic, anything that's a stereo recording.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what about other recording setups? A coincident, a cross figure eights, or a Kelrec sound field mic? Have you experimented with other mics?
Yeah, coincident mics, like a Blumline type of arrangement, I find is basically just supplying one of the three cues, maybe two of the three cues that we use, but it's not giving me all three. The only method I found that gives me all three is, so far, is the one I've been using. I've tried ORTF spacing also, but I just find that when I got to the arrangement I'm using now, I'm finding that when I sit and listen to a playback, everyone is where I heard them when I was at the session. I get the same sense of left and right and the same sense of distance. So far, it's the best arrangement I found.
Have you done some test recordings, like walking around the room and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's how I arrived at the arrangement I'm using. I had different mic arrangements, and then I'd walk around the room and announce where I was and knock on a wooden block. And I made several recordings with different mic arrangements. And when I got to this one, I heard my position sounding like where I actually was. It seemed the closest to me. And now when I use it in real sessions, it's I hear what I heard at the session in terms of localization.
Thanks. Arnie, you have another question?
Yeah, Barry, about this business of hearing the sound outside of your speakers. Now, with your recordings, is that what you're supposed to hear, or is that what you're not supposed to hear?
I'm not aiming to push the sound out. I'm aiming to get a representation that sounds like what I heard at the position. I know in the old days, we had Carver had a system, something called anti-phase panning, where you could invert the polarity of a signal and mix it into the opposite channel. For example, if I take the right channel signal, flip its polarity, and mix it into the left channel down to about 6 dB, I'm pushing that sound from the right speaker out further to the right. So it's to the right of the listening chair, instead of in front of you on the right where the speaker is. I'm not aiming for that in my recordings. I know when I sit and listen here, I'm not hearing something outside of the speakers. I'm hearing the area of my room behind the speakers turn into the recording venue as close as I can achieve. And people are positioned where I heard them with the same kind of spacing. So I'm not seeking to get outside the speakers.
Well, the thing that I find curious is that I read in reviews, sometimes they say, and yeah, and this speaker always, I'm not talking about now speakers, the way I have set up the speaker, I have this wonderful outside, the images beyond the speakers on left and right. And I find that curious because I think it has to depend on the recording.
It does.
Some recording, if your system is accurate, whatever you want to call it, I completely agree with you in my experience also, this business about, I have to say that a good system has to play back every recording differently. You have to be able to discern the difference. And
that
so
includes the soundstage.
And to say everything, including the soundstage and so on. And so I find it I'm skeptical about this thing that, I had this wonderful, image outside the speakers. I don't find that's so. There are some recordings that will give you that, and there are some recordings that will not give you that. And I think that's the way, that's more accurately how it is in the whole recording business.
Yeah, I hear it the same way. And of course, if there's a reflection in the room, that could push an image outside.
Exactly.
So the room comes into play on top. I mean, the recording, number one, but the room, the speaker itself, how's the speaker sending the sound? Is it pointing at a reflecting area in the room that would lead you to hear the image pulled toward that reflection? They all come into play. But yeah, the recording is it. I mean, the system should give you the space that's in the recording. The width should change depending on the width that was captured in the recording, right, whether it's real or artificially induced.
Yeah, Arnie, I agree with you completely. Some of the recordings that I have that image way outside the loudspeakers, Barry and I were talking about this. I kind of use them for a setup, for like where to put the listening chair, where to put the loudspeakers, because on recordings that I know should have images, should image way outside the speakers, if my setup isn't right, the image gets pulled in and it becomes more like a normal stereo soundstage. So I have 5 or 6 tracks marked in my library that I play if I'm fooling around with the speaker or listening chair setup, because I want to hear them played back the way they should be. And I was mentioning to Barry, like the mining for gold from the Trinity sessions with that one track with the Calrec microphone in a church. You hear the heating system off to the sides of the speakers. You don't hear the Margot Timmons. Margot Timmons should sound like she's right there, but there should be sound coming from your walls. But that's very, very unusual. But I do have some favorite recordings like that I just use for reference, besides liking the music.
Okay, Barry, well, I have to leave now, so thank you very much for everything. And it was a wonderful presentation, and we've had some nice thoughts during the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Arnie. Great to see you again.
To be continued.
Yes.
Thanks, Arnie. See you soon. Gary, go ahead. You had a follow-up?
Well, it's semi-simple. The sound that you hear in your room is a combination of the direct and reflected sound that's being projected by your speakers. Like Barry's got magnepans, right?
Yes.
It's a bi-directional, almost omnidirectional speaker, depending on how he tows them. If you tow them in about 30 degrees, it'll project the rear sound toward the corners and the side walls, and you will hear the sound come from behind the speakers and outside of the speakers. Is that what you perceive, Barry?
Actually, they're not near omnidirectional. They because they're dipoles, they're more of a figure eight. But what I have in my room, I don't know if you saw the photo earlier. It's on the on one of the websites. I have absorption in the corners and at the reflection points where the speakers would be reflected from that front wall, as seen from the listening position. So I'm capturing that much of that back wave. And there is a lot of toe in the speaker. That's by design. The manufacturer suggests the tweeter section should be about an inch further away from you than the woofer section of the speaker, for lack of a better term. And I found that when I did that, it took the focus up a step. So I have a lot of toe in. And yeah, you could say they're pointing toward the corners, but then there's a big 16-inch diameter trap as tall as the speakers in each of the corners, with the soft side of the trap facing the speaker. So it's absorbing what's coming back there.
And it also depends on how close you sit to the speakers. If you're sitting in a more near field position, and if your speakers are out from the wall, like in my case, I have Magnepans, but they're 6 feet out from the wall behind them. And I sit about 7.5 feet back. So the reflection coming off the back wall is so delayed in time. I feel like it's not really interfering with the image. And then I don't want to get into the weeds, but for Magnepan fans also, it depends, your toe in depends on whether you have the tweeters on the inside or the outside. And when you have the tweeters on the inside, like Barry does, you need a lot of toe in, which isn't what you might think, because the toe in is not for image focus per se, but you actually need a lot of toe in, even though the tweeters are on the inside. And when the tweeters are on the outside, you need much less toe in. So it really depends on the speaker position, the listening position, and where the tweeters are, or whether they're inside or outside. Does that sum it up, kind of?
I think so.
Do we have any other questions? A recording engineer or question for you, Barry. Do you ever use any compression, or do you ride gain after the fact? Do you ride gain during the recording? I know that at the mix place, John Quinn used to tell me about Bob Fine and George Purist mastering and cutting records. And one of the reasons among many that those recordings sound dynamic was they were just geniuses at writing gain, and manually. And they had a score in front of them, and they decided, so they controlled the dynamics, and they did compress dynamic range, but they did it manually and
writing the gain. Yeah, I used to see George do that when he was cutting vinyl. To answer your question, I use no compression at all. I ask the band before we start recording to play as loud as they possibly can. And for the initial capture to digital, I like to stay well below -6, just because I found that every monolithic A to D converter I've ever experienced has less distortion there than it does at -2 or -3. At 24 bits, I don't care if my maximum peak is at -20 or -15. I'll adjust the final level in the mastering, but I asked the band to play really loud, and I set my level based on that. And once we go, I don't touch it again. I think, personally, I think dynamics are one of the last frontiers in making recordings that sound convincing, both in the recording and in the playback end. So I leave the dynamics alone. To be clear, when I was talking about -6 maximum or staying below it, I'm talking about the initial time you hit digital. Once it's digital, I feel free to adjust it, but I'll never go up to 0. I mean, most of the engineers I know who I respect think of 0 as an overload. not past 0 as an overload. In the old days, they used to say you're not using all the resolution unless you get up, very close to 0. When I master now, I'll leave, depending on the recording, at least a fraction, like a third of a dB or a half a dB. I won't let it get closer to 0 than that. And the reason is as my best understanding of this, and it may be loose, is that on reconstruction, there are intersample peaks that exceed the maximum. So if you're already at 0, and a lot of DACs are clipping or stick at 0, I found that you'll hear little noises just when you hit 0. You'll hear a little artifact happen. But if the samples that exceed that will go past 0. So I think it may have to do with intersample peaks. And then in terms of the recordings that are lower than that already, but where you still hear an issue, maybe in the initial recording, they hit an overload or something and the mastering engineer brought it down so that it wouldn't look like they were hitting 0 or going past it.
I downloaded a 24 192 recording, and my friend had downloaded it from iTunes, and it was one of those mastered for iTunes, and they're supposed to be, I believe, like no peaks higher than -1 or something like that. Both my friend and I thought the iTunes download sounded better than the 24 192 on several systems we played it on. And when I pulled them both into Audacity, there was clipping just throughout the 24 192 download, no clipping at all on the supposedly inferior iTunes one. So it's an example of sometimes you're not comparing like with like when even digital.
Differences beyond the format.
Yeah, right.
If it's different mastering, then that's what you're comparing.
Right. It was mastered differently. Even it may have been the same mastering engineer doing it, but it was mastered differently. So anyway, I see no more questions. And Barry, you've been with us for 2.5 hours. My apologies.
No, not at all. It's been wonderful. This has been a lot of fun.